Test, test. Test, test.
I'll just need to do the slides.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tricia. Hold on a minute.
And popcorn is. I see you now, but the Oreos in there. Well, we want to wait a little bit longer and get started.
Get started.
Yeah. She might have walked into the ed center like I did.
That could be. That could be.
Yeah. It's like, I knew that it was Eric.
Just gotta have it. Only because.
She
Wagon and was like, oh, hello. But our microphone is not like your low voice.
Oh, my low register.
Yeah.
Liam or something.
Yeah. Remember that?
There you go.
All right, we're ready to get started.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. After today, we have 2 more scheduled meetings. And we'll be in May here in just a couple days. So
Right.
Thank you all again for being here, and we'll be back at our regularly scheduled location next week. So we will start as usual with committee updates, and Eric has information from Extracurricular Academic Support Committee.
So that's coming around now, and what you're gonna be getting is a listing of the different proposals that our committee heard this year as they were ranked by the consensus of our group. So there are 9 things that kind of made it through the whole process and had everything squared away. And one thing you will see as you're looking at these is that we did make sure for each one of these, we have the current amount of money that's being spent from wherever that money is being spent to support these different positions. And then also compared that to a total max cost if that position were to be completely filled. You'll also see that we have one listed down below because we weren't really sure how to handle this part, because I think in most years, everything that the ECAS committee has brought forward has ended up being approved. But we felt like there were a couple things left on the table last time that we want to just make sure are still on the radar, the high school capstone position that we are still hearing about that made through the process last year, but then was not part of our plan negotiation. So that is still kind of on our list on the radar, but I'll go through the 9 up above that are new to us. The first one was by far the consensus first priority. This is our event coverage pay rate. So this has to do with the amount that we pay for all kinds of support of a variety of activities, primarily at the middle and high school levels, that we, rather than paying our certified staff per hour, we pay at a rate that is per event. And when we have it all coded as how many events each thing counts as. And so the group that looked at that recommended an increase of that pay from $24 an event to $30 an event. That comes from doing a lot of comps with neighboring districts and looking at what other people are doing as far as trying to make things as comparable as possible to what seems the most fair there. And I believe the last time that was increased was about 10 years ago. So that is of all of our proposals, it's one of the larger ones, but it was by far the first priority coming. The second one is the high school esports coach. That is as of last week, or I guess officially as of whenever they publish the minutes from last week's meeting. Like, that's a done deal. Keisha Esports is going to be a thing. So, recognizing that within our salary schedule rather than the kind of resolving problems as we deal with them right now that we're doing. And you can see we're currently paying coaches some for that out of the stipend at the district level, but this would be putting it on the salary schedule. The third is adding a musical director position at the middle school level. Our middle schools do musicals, and that often requires more than just the one drama teacher. So this would be a separate role for that particular person. The fourth one there is the special chorus groups at the elementary school level. This is largely, and you all can jump in and help me if you need to, but this is largely a consequence of our going from A through E to A through D, that special chorus time had been happening more during the school day and within contract time. And now, in order to maintain that activity at the level that we want to at all the different elementary schools, it's turning out to be a lot of work outside the contract day, so moving it to a stipended position. The other thing I want to mention on that is that our committee is largely high school and middle school weighted. So anytime we see something with an elementary school position, I sort of look at it as keeping in mind that was voted on primarily by people that are not elementary school admin and teachers. So as you're looking at the different rankings, I think that's important context there.
If I could add just a little bit on that one, this is actually taking the current stipend for our elementary music teachers and including within that stipend. That's why there's a difference between what we currently pay versus what we're proposing, including in that the extra work related to special chorus, which is district approved curriculum, which because of, as Eric said, the switch to the A through D rotation, there's less time within that day to prep for it, to actually teach it. Every school is teaching it a little differently in terms of what time of day, but regardless, even if it's within the student contact day, the contract day, the prep is now have to be bounced outside of that.
Yeah, so it's just an increase to the current general music stipend, so not necessarily, or it's not a special chorus stipend, but it's just a proposed increase to the general music current stipend.
Number 5 is adding a support position for the high school marching bands. And this is primarily having to do with adding the possibility of having an extra body there for a couple of important weeks to the marching band, specifically a lot of their pre-students that's outside in heat and dealing with different things and making sure that there's enough trained supervision there is really important. So this would be one that perhaps could vary in the same way that some of our assistant coaching positions building to building vary year to year, depending on how many people are in each school's band, but adding that kind of default of an extra position there at those different camps. The 6th is clarifying and solidifying the expectations for video production at each of the 5 high schools. That's currently done a little bit differently at each site. And this would be setting a baseline of expectations and pay that would be kind of in agreement with that plan. The 7th is to increase the stipend that is given to our student naturalist teachers for animal care. The current rate that they get is $12 an hour. This is recommending an increase to $26 an hour for that skilled labor. These folks are on call really 12 months out of the year. If there's ever anything that falls through with any of their animals, they don't get the option to necessarily not feed the animal or not like cover for it if something happens with their first plan of trying to deal with what's going on. So that this is just, again, that's pay that's already happening. It's just a proposed increase. The 8th one is for our speech pathologists, an increase in the stipend for bilingual support. And
yeah, I mean, I think the big thing with this one is we had a lot of interest in looking at bilingual stipends across different job categories, but this one is unique because when a student is being screened, of course, for SLP services, they have to be screened in English and their native language to identify it's something that requires SLP support. So they not only support their own buildings, but students across the district. And in addition, they also work with parent communication, IEP meetings. So there's a current stipend that's kind of outside of the negotiated agreement. So this includes that stipend plus some specific job tasks that aren't included in the current stipend.
And other important context here is that last year we had 7 people in this role. We currently are down to 4 as of the printing of this sheet, which might not be 4 at this point. It's hard to know what people's plans are going to be with that. And the last one that came across new that got through our group is the student affinity groups. This is our like belonging and inclusion kind of piece at the different high schools that function kind of different ways at different schools, but there is a unified job description for that we can share too. Those are currently being done on a volunteer basis. This would recommend a small stipend for those roles. In the total, if you were to roll in all 9 of those new proposals, you'd be looking at $174,774.
744.
174,774.
Thank you.
It is. 174,774.
That's the total of the.
No, just the
increase-
9, the new,
The increase in spend.
the increased annual spend cost, yes.
Talking to Parker this weekend a little bit, and he reminded me that the hope would be that we could move the event coverage as was the #1 priority here, but then in the future move that to an hourly rate because that seems to be what is happening in our surrounding districts. But we thought we would propose one shift at a time. But this would put us more in line with our neighboring districts.
And the costs are easier to predict.
Yes.
Couple of questions. Do you, like your esports and, student affinity, are they outside of contract time or inside of?
They're outside.
Both of those are outside.
Yep.
I was just looking at special chorus, so we had to submit when special chorus was taking place and out of all of the elementary schools that they are taking place during contract time, except for one school, which is outside. So I was just restating that that's for our.
Is the time
Sorry.
the instruction happened or the planning for it?
I was just saying the instruction.
The instruction.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, it used to be.
It used to be an after, like, you know,
Yeah.
but now it's like during the.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
and before we had the A through D rotation, it was allocated a 1.5 section. And now it's not allocated to any section, so that has, the results of that has been more of that prep work is happening outside of the school day. And so we gathered a lot of information on that across the district. Yeah, it does vary. Some schools do it during the contract day, but outside of the student contact day, it does vary based on the needs of the school.
For the music director, and I'm kind of seeing this evolve over time to where we start to see a musical and now alternate. I think we're all doing the musicals. Like some schools are starting to do a second musical. Is sometimes, I know we had some this year that had 2 musicals. Is that per musical or is it just a position?
I think the intent is that it's 1 position per middle school.
It's not per musical, it's for each school.
And if there's a year they opt to do standard play rather than doing musical. So just
Yeah, we'd have to look at, I'd have to pull up the job category or the job description that we came up with. Because it says for plays and musicals there. So that we'd have to double check that on the job description.
question with the affinity groups, is it distinguished between affinity groups and student initiated groups? Like I have a paper form, is that gonna be, like I have student initiated groups that are, you know, truly like student initiated, we have a teacher that sponsors it, but they're kind of there in supervisory role only. Or two separate deals?
Yeah, so and this particular proposal was written for high school only, not that the work that happens at the other levels in that capacity is not important. That's just the proposal that came to the committee. These would be student initiated affinity groups. And we collected data from the existing affinity group leaders at every high school to look at the number of hours outside of the contract day. And then they were supervising students for clubs. They were doing paperwork, field trips, you know, all of the things that an educator who would be supervising a student initiated group that's an affinity group would be doing. And based on that, that's how we placed it at the group 20. We also know that each high school does have a different number of affinity groups. So what we went with is for the proposal is we would go with 5 per high school and then leave it at that just so that we would have a number that we could consistently rely on. Obviously, if there weren't 5, then we wouldn't pay somebody for doing that, but up to 5, at least to start, was the proposal.
How they're ranked is how they're numbered into that.
Yeah, and you can tell on the chart below when 2 are closer, like video production, student naturalist, that those rankings were a little closer. But you see number 1 event coverage was very clearly a top choice. So I didn't know if you wanted to do an update and then a proposal later, if you wanted to do the proposal. Put it on there and.
Happy to go through the proposals and that'll pretty much be the update for the committee.
Okay.
So I use the SharePoint, so we'll see how this goes, but you'll find all of the information in there. I'm sure this is the end.
That was the spare unit they could find. It used to be at the MP gym. Yeah, it is. Yeah, yeah.
I was joking.
No, that's where they pulled it out of. The one that came out of the MP gym.
Okay.
And I'm a mess.
Okay.
I'm just like-
So, a lot of this is going to be similar to the appraisal committee updates that I've been giving, but this is the proposal that came out of the appraisal committee for the last, couple of years. And so I thought I would first start and kind of give a little bit of foundation and background as to how this kind of launched. So there was a joint concern regarding a few different things as it relates to our appraisal rubrics. We had some outdated rubrics, but then we also had some employee groups, if you will,
that their rubrics were there really wasn't a rubric that fit their job title and position. Along with that, there was confusion by our educators as well as our administrators regarding some of the steps in the appraisal process. A little bit of confusion over that. And then a third concern that we were hoping to address through our work was the length of time that elapses and the efficiency of providing support for struggling educators when we get to that level of the district intensive assistance panel. And so as a result of these, we began meeting regularly as an appraisal committee at the beginning of last year. So during the 23-24 school year, and we began meeting monthly. So we have met every month through 23-24 and then here through 24-25 as well. So in terms of the work that this committee did, we first started and of course explored kind of rubric options. And as we did that, we all recognized that the first step in the process was going to be putting together the general educator rubric. And so we looked at a lot of different options there, and many of you have heard of the KEEP, which is the Kansas Educators Evaluation Protocol. And that has really become kind of the, I guess, gold standard, if you will, throughout the state, and has been heavily researched. And so as we started to explore that, that is really kind of where we settled for our general educator rubric. So as we identified that, we also knew, as I mentioned before, that we had some employee groups that we also had some specialized rubrics, is kind of how we referred to them, that were not general educators. So you can see the list there, and these were all of those kind of employee groups or educator groups that we identified that their roles and responsibilities look different enough from a general education classroom educator that we wanted to be sure we had specialized rubrics for them. So as we started to dive into that work, we knew that we as an appraisal committee were obviously not going to have the expertise around the table to develop those. So Dr. Donovan and Mr. Howe worked with leaders in those departments to put together committees of staff members within those employee groups to develop their rubrics for their specialized areas. So as that work was going on last year, then we also started to look at the appraisal platform options. So this is what technology kind of platform we wanted to use, because there are options out there outside of Frontline. The state has the KEEP platform that any district can tap into and use. So we took a look at that. We also looked at what Frontline would have to offer, and really kind of where we settled here. Oh, we also initially were looking at if we wanted to use Oracle for this as well. But where we landed was knowing that this is going to be a pretty heavy lift and a change. We wanted to keep as much consistency as we could. We know people, and all of us know Frontline and kind of what it looks like and feels like. And then working with Frontline, knew that they have created that same kind of KEEP process in numerous other districts, and could then also customize it as we wanted to do so. So as we got through kind of that piece of the process, we then went back and revisited those specialized rubrics. So those committees were working, these subcommittees in the specialized rubric areas were working. They submitted those drafts. We provided kind of feedback back on those. And then those committee heads and employee groups kind of worked in finishing those up. Our next phase in the process, which was really all of this year, we focused in on kind of the appraisal timeline and process. So really we did a lot of time looking at state statute and what the requirements are for the appraisal timeline and process, because there were some things that in our current system really didn't quite match up with those. So we really used that as kind of our starting point for developing those pieces. The KEEP already has a handbook created that has all of that kind of incorporated. So we use that again as kind of our template to begin with. And so we worked through a number of different rounds of looking at feedback on that process and the timeline that was a part of KEEP, if you will, and just met last week to kind of go back through any additional feedback we had gotten and finalize that draft that we would be moving forward with. As we were having all of these conversations, we really settled on the fact that we didn't feel comfortable launching a new appraisal district-wide next year, that we really wanted to have a chance to kind of test it out and be able to get feedback with a smaller group of administrators and educators, and be able to make some tweaks along the way, whether that was with the rubrics or with the timeline of process. And so you can see here what we settled on is doing a pilot for next year. And so what you'll be seeing us propose tonight is to pilot this, what we're calling the Olathe Keep, in 5 of our buildings. So that would be in 2 elementary schools. It would be at Forest View and Countryside, and then 2 middle schools, California Trail and Chisholm Trail, and then 1 high school at Olathe West. So I have had conversations with all 5 of those administrators, and they're very excited to take part in the pilot. And so as we kind of look at a timeline of moving forward, this is what we kind of proposed as an appraisal committee is, of course, tonight submitting what our recommendation to professional counsel. And the next phase that we'll be going through in the HR world is, of course, creating those rubrics and the process and everything in Frontline. And then from there, developing our administrator training tools, and then the educator training tools and additional resources, and then training those pilot administrators so that we can be ready for that full pilot implementation in the fall. So our plan for next year then is to continue to meet as an appraisal committee. We didn't think that it would probably be very beneficial to meet in August and September. We knew we wanted a little bit of time to lapse so that those pilot buildings could actually get going in the appraisal process and kind of get through that first phase, and then be able to convene together and get that feedback from both administrators and educators. And then from there, it will really just kind of be ongoing kind of live updates and edits as we move along on both those rubrics and the process. And then our intent would be to submit next year to professional counsel that updated version after having the chance to test it for full implementation for that following year in 26-27. So what we have this evening is our draft language, which is policy GBZCB. And here's probably a little easier version to read. So full transparency, this was Lachelle's mind working, and this may not make sense to anyone else. So we may have to have some conversation about what this looks like. Because we're piloting in 5 buildings, obviously, the rest of the buildings will be continuing with the current appraisal process. And so I didn't want to change any of that current language that's in this appraisal process in our negotiated agreement, but did want to make sure that we denoted what our plan was for this year. So you can see here in red is the language that I had added, denoting the 25-26 Olathe Keep appraisal pilot. And so I shared that during the 25-26 contract year, a new certified appraisal process will be piloted in 5 school buildings and across employee groups who utilize specialized rubrics. Licensed/certified employees within these 5 buildings and those included in the list of specialized employee groups below will participate in the Olathe Keep appraisal process as outlined in the Olathe Keep handbook, which I thought we would add to our appendix and make it Appendix C1 within the negotiated agreement. And then the pilot appraisal process meets the statutory requirements of the professional negotiations, and you can see the statutes noted there. And then I listed those 5 buildings, and then noted in addition to this, that these buildings, the following licensed certified employees will also be participating in the Olathe Keep as part of the 25-26 pilot. So you may notice that that list of specialized rubrics here is smaller than the original list, and here's why. The other employee groups that are on specialized rubrics are evaluated by building principals. And so we combed through to look to see that and make sure that we had somebody in each of those groups in one of our 5 buildings that will be on appraisal next year. We were trying to keep as narrow as we could the number of administrators that we're going to have to be toggling back and forth between, you know, the current process and this pilot one. And so in order to do that, we took a look at, you know, making sure we could have somebody in those groups that are in those buildings. These individual employee groups here are evaluated by someone besides a building principal. And so, for example, on our instructional coaches, so they're evaluated by either Times or Addison or Julie Beach. And so, knowing that, we thought we could utilize anyone that's an instructional coach that's on appraisal next year. We could use the pilot one with them, and then that would give us a chance for us to have feedback from more than one instructional coach potentially, but also have administrator feedback too from individuals who have utilized both of those. And that's what I've got.
On the library media specialist.
Oh, that shouldn't be on there.
Okay.
Thank you for catching that.
Can you go back up to kind of the feedback timing that you had for like the appraisal committee? So October, December.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think it was slide 3.
Oh, there you go.
October, December, January, February. Is it gonna, I feel like a lot continues in March, April, May, and we would want a full year. So is there a reason why we're not including those months?
Yeah, well, our intent is to be able to get all of this updated so we can have it ready for negotiations and for the professional council. So we can certainly meet more than this. This would get us through a full cycle though with new educators as well as experienced educators. But we certainly can meet and probably will need to meet depending on kind of what our feedback is. I would also envision that we'll probably have some subcommittees of our appraisal committee. For example, those specialized employee groups. I would envision some of that kind of feedback funneling through those administrators that headed up those committees as well. So there'll be meetings outside of the whole appraisal committee too.
Is there any concern about having a full appraisal implementation in 26-27 as well as Canvas full implementation with both two major things, full implementation in the same year?
From what aspect? From just a human capacity or technology?
I think that's a lot.
I didn't even think the technology.
That's a lot of spreadsheets.
I think we have to keep in mind that not everyone's on appraisal. So it's not as if when you even roll out district-wide, it's not every educator that's going to be appraised in that first year. It'll be approximately a third.
Well, we would all have to understand how to keep our current standards of data. So it would be everyone, because we would have to understand starting that first year in the new system, what that would look like. So I feel like it will impact every educator, whether you're on the start of the cycle.
Collecting data.
Like the data piece is gonna be different, so that's gonna be.
Well, the data really isn't going to be different.
Yeah, the data piece we do, the process of the data is similar. I'm not sure what that's gonna look like on frontline, so that piece, that we got really got a visualization of what that piece would look like. So I know currently educators put their data in once every 3 years if they're on a career, and we kind of had talked about maybe that could be
a little more regular.
so it doesn't seem like you're only keeping data every 3 years, because we all know that's not what happens.
We really were conscientious of, where we could keep language and those, the appraisal handbook, our draft is in the shared drive as well, but we really tried to keep as many things that we could in terms of language and that kind of thing the same. So you'll see on standard 6, that the language from our current appraisal is exactly the same in that as well.
So even if some of the terminology is changing, it's still that student performance piece
Yes.
would be pretty much identical to what we're currently
Yes,
doing in
yeah.
Fall Standard Six.
Yeah, and the expectation for, identifying 3 and being able to reflect on those 3 and even the rating piece of that, we kept all the same and kept that language the same.
The cycles are kind of the same still too, where career educators on a 3-year cycle.
Yeah,
career educators on
yeah.
4.
The big rock pieces of that will be the same. There's a little bit of a nuance for a year 2 educator. Right now, in year 2, there aren't necessarily 2 summative evals done. That will change in this system. There'll be 2 summative actual rubric evals completed once each semester, and that's to keep in line with statute.
When gathering feedback, are we planning on, I don't know if this is a question you guys can even answer yet. Is that gonna be done with the staffs of the pilot schools or just from the administrators and a couple of the teachers
Yeah,
sitting on the committee?
right. Well, I think we'll do a little of both.
Mhm.
So I would envision that, for example, Rick's building is going to be one piloting. So, Rick would be getting that feedback from those educators that are on that pilot appraisal. But then we would also utilize those individuals that are a part of our committee as
Mhm.
well. I think that's going to be part of what we'll have to kind of figure out too, is what's the best format for that? Like, we want to use kind of a standard little questionnaire that educators complete and
Mhm.
submit so we can kind of see. But those are the things that we felt like having a pilot year would give us a chance to kind of, okay.
Sure, I see like using that as like a very proactive way when we switch over
Right.
all staff onto this, being able to be like, this was tricky for our staff, to kind of help educate. And things
Yeah,
like
and
that.
I think it'll be a huge piece for us to understand on the training side too, like, you spend a lot of time on this, you need to spend a lot of time on that, but we did need more on this, and we maybe need concrete examples and that kind of thing, so. I think we all felt a little like, okay, like feeling better about being able to pilot rather than, I'll be honest, I've never been in a district where we piloted first. We rolled out and it was kind of like, everybody say your prayers that everything goes okay. So, not that this isn't stressful and you don't want it to go off without a hitch, but it gives us a nice opportunity to be able to make adjustments too.
Think of how to form the question, like, what if an educator were to see a drastic change in their evaluation? Like if they're part of the pilot, like up or down, and like, is it similar enough that there shouldn't be like a huge shift, or like what could some of the potential, not consequences, but like ramifications of this be? Whereas if they were like, if I was on the old system, this wouldn't have flagged. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
I don't know that I could tell you for sure, Julia, to be honest, particularly when we get into those specialized
Sure.
rubric areas. I think that's where we'll really want the feedback and seeing, and if we see that there's something that we're like, oh my goodness, this like was kind of across the board.
Drastically different.
Yeah. But I also will say that there's probably going to be some natural pieces to that. I think anytime you move to an appraisal that, I think everyone will see this is a much more kind of targeted in some ways, but also more current and relevant. That there may be areas that people are not meeting the top standard as they were before. And I think some of that is kind of coming along philosophically with what the intent and purpose of an appraisal is kind of that constant learning and improving. I will say, from having implemented a new appraisal in 2 previous districts, that was something we saw, was that we did see a shift from not everyone being in the highest category. Which also led us to kind of reflect and know that our prior appraisal was really maybe not doing what we wanted it to do too, in terms of giving authentic feedback in terms of what's happening in classrooms right now.
Word on this, we'll have a longer negotiated agreement next year with coming to operational systems. So we could kill a few more trees. But I think doing it in pilot manner will allow us to reduce disruption and maybe work out some kinks.
And I think the nice thing too is like even in our current, handbook, we don't have every rubric printed in there, so that will help us too. Because I thought about printing for today, and then I was like, oh my goodness.
So the standards are in there, but not all of them.
Yeah, and you'll see that, and I have to give, kudos to Justin and Kathy and all of those specialized rubric group leaders, because they spent a ton of time and really getting kind of all of that to be in a similar format and language as that general educator, using constructs and indicators and that kind of thing. So I think we'll see a lot more continuity throughout all the rubrics too, which will be nice. But yes, it will mean that our appendix C gets longer.
Going to go through the handbook page by page today is probably not happening.
Well, I think I want to also reiterate that this is not my work. This was an appraisal committee of a lot of people that met for 2 years. So again, big thanks to all of them that committed a lot of time too. So.
Well, we have a couple different directions we could go next. We could discuss previous proposals. We could get into counter proposals. And then we have another district proposal awaiting. So where would you like to go next?
Just work our way down the agenda so we don't get lost.
Perfect. Do we want to go through review the draft? Yeah, we just got one on each slide just to be like, just to make sure we're, especially if we are able to come to a tentative agreement for the end of the year.
Yep.
We got to get this together real quickly to get a vote done. So I think you did this last time. You want me to do it this time?
Okay. It's gonna be a little bit of reading this slide. So.
Yes.
So first thing, we updated the policy on the professional day to include language on kindergarten enrollment, how that affects our early
Our second, updated plan time language to be more reflective of all educators and, not just kind of generalized language for general classroom educators. Sure, job specific necessities, there's language to represent that. We also approved the CEU proposal for professional learning. So, some of our, supporting educators, will be able to get CEU credit during otherwise PE that might not otherwise apply to them. Be huge, and as well as submit, applications for refunds on some of those CEU credits.
And that portion is one that we tabled for compensation, the.
Yes. Yes, Medicaid billing stuff, that includes Medicaid billing, so like nurses or CPR staff, etc. Will be exempted from regularly scheduled duties, so they have the opportunity to get that Medicaid billing done during the same day. And if, the included language, if it's not after school, agree with the administrator at common time during the day. Yeah.
And that one we did make the language match, like Clint mentioned last time. Yeah, no, you're good.
Last draft consensus, I believe, is adding language for unscheduled building needs that would cause an educator to miss their clean time, their protected time. So meeting with the administrator when it becomes a very frequent occurrence of how we can problem solve and kind of come with steps to ensure that's not happening.
So I think that was all.
And that was, yeah, outside of the calendars, which we didn't put on our screen. because
The
they-
calendars, and then we had the drug-free schools.
Yeah.
and then-
Yeah, drug-free schools and the non-resident schools.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yes. What is the next one? I think the next one's probably, is it one? Yeah.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. We obviously looked at kind of what you proposed or the option there, and we had the opportunity to discuss that, get some feedback from others too, including some information on curriculum and resource selection, because there are other experts outside this room in that, so we wanted to make sure to touch base with some of those people, and also professional learning plan moving forward also that we may not have known about. What we talked about as we looked into that more, we already have in place the I-Series of BOE policies which address instructional resources, curriculum adoption. And of course, as you know, obviously the adoption process, the overall adoption process includes that teacher participation in the process through the selection committee for the initial curriculum adoption anyway. But in that I-Series of BOE policy, we look more specifically at IFBB, which specifically addresses process and policy around selecting building level and then classroom level instructional materials, including supplemental materials, which I think was mentioned last time.
Can you say those letters one more time?
I'm sorry, IFBB, BB, that's Board of Education policy IFBB. But included in that, the whole I-Series really addresses, there's several of them that address curriculum and resources. You know, we always know there's opportunities for us to improve student achievement, and obviously research tells us that part of that the process is high quality instructional materials that are vetted and research based. And it's all part of that consistent and viable curriculum that we talk about a lot. Our thought was maybe, because some of what we heard last time is it may be a larger issue or question at some levels than others, and maybe some more specific issues surfacing. So versus kind of the level committees with that wide ranging focus or broad charge, we thought about certainly support additional discussion on any specific concerns that are coming up. I think you specifically mentioned supplemental materials with Wit and Wisdom, maybe.
That's just, yeah.
Right, but that was one example. To answer any questions, clear up confusion, and also collaborate on some solutions in that area. Welcome the opportunity to have that conversation. Not sure a 30-person committee may be the best way to do that by level. You know, we especially addressing specific cases such as that one, and provide an avenue with some maybe collaborative dialogue on what that looks like, or maybe where those issues are rising, because as you said, it kind of depended building by building too, even, not necessarily by level, by general level either. And providing that collaborative dialogue with people that are most closely involved in the curriculum and instructional materials in our district, i.e., content coordinators, and some of those other appropriate learning services personnel that have more intimate knowledge maybe on that than some of us in this room, especially me. So there's certainly agreement that the discussions around this topic are important, obviously, and what we did learn is there are plans being developed for some professional learning, starting in pre-service and then running into next year, and involving high quality instructional materials and then supplemental materials also. And so it's our hope and kind of thought that with the professional learning that's already being developed around that topic, starting in pre-service and through the fall, and then maybe some more targeted conversations, getting the right people in the room, maybe with some of those specific concerns. I think we can probably provide some clarity and also help address those concerns too.
Brain's just wrapping around that. So you're thinking more of informal conversations than the subcommittees?
Not necessarily more informal conversation, I think targeted conversations, because the way obviously it was written, it was one of 3 different ways to address a very broad issue, right? That obviously was different by level and maybe more of a concern at certain levels than others. So I think obviously if there are specific instances, I think that's where we need to maybe have a targeted conversation and put our heads together and say, what's the concern here and how do we address that? And how does it ultimately fit into our Board of Education policies? Because obviously we have to work within that framework too. Because those are already policies in place.
Do you have thoughts of how those targeted conversations? I'm just thinking of how that would be set up or the mechanism for that to occur. Is that what we had presented was through the subcommittees that we already had established, but if we're not going to use those, I think it'd be helpful for us to kind of understand what would that look like if we're not going to use the subcommittees.
Well, I would say something that are already established. If you look at those lists, they're not really established, so we want to open them. So it would take some work to get those up and running. And I think ultimately, obviously, you guys hear concerns of certain instances and things like that. So obviously, bringing those to us, and then we can get the right people in the room to address those too. Yeah, I mean, Angie, I think you're comfortable anytime that comes up, giving me a ring, and we get the right people around the table, and certainly we can pull in, the educators that affects, and then line those up with, if it's curriculum related, get the right people in the room to talk about those things that have done a lot of work on the other side of developing those materials too, so that we have the right people around the table to talk about it.
You mentioned some pre-service training on high quality instructional materials, and then obviously some professional learning throughout the fall. I'm wondering, as those trainings are being developed, if some of the feedback that we shared here about being able to balance the fidelity to those high quality instructional materials with the autonomy to do what the students in the room need to do, if that feedback is part of the consideration as those trainings and those professional learning opportunities are being developed.
Yeah, I think again, getting the right people in the room to hear those too, and obviously we can share them, but I think we can, between you and I, we can probably, as they're developing that, have those conversations.
I think that being able to, whenever our trainings are based on a larger portion or a more comprehensive collection of feedback, for lack of a better term, the more that those doing the training can anticipate some potential concerns coming into that, then
Yeah.
that just gives them the ability to, you know, integrate that into the planning.
Well, and I think part of that, the professional learning can be better understanding of some of those board policies too, and how to navigate those, because it really does speak to supplemental materials in several different ways. So making sure maybe that's part of the training too.
That would be helpful.
Yeah. I think if you've got the more specific feedback to that, and get that to Dr. Reeves or those that are working on that. Absolutely provide that to them as they look to the specifics of that training.
Next,
Yeah.
where we stopped, on the last two policies, so go to,
The leave policies.
yeah, going. Keep going. There we go. So this is where we left off last time on lead bank proposal with the counter. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just adding vacation in that one area.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think we
Yeah.
we're good with that, so.
And we'd love to partner on ways to figure out how to better communicate or get the word out about short-term disability.
Yeah,
I think that could be across the board.
yeah.
Yeah, but particularly with those really,
I talked to Ann Anderson a little bit today about that. So, I mean, it's tough because pre-service is already so full.
right.
And for some of our first year educators, this might be the first time they're doing benefits in this way. And some of them might still be on parents' medical insurance, but so trying to figure out how to get that information to them without further confusing them or, overwhelming them. I don't know the answer to that, but.
And we try to be really careful too, with, of course, any new hire to the district to, provide the information they need to make those decisions about voluntary benefits, while at the same time not be in the seat of telling them which ones they should and shouldn't take, so. But I know both Justin and Kathy also have conversations, particularly with, I think it's those that are just the like college graduates that are, 23, 22 years old. And because we even sometimes have to have the conversation that most of the time you can't stay on your parents' insurance. Usually there's a caveat written into their policy that says if you're offered health insurance, you have to take it. And so having had some of those conversations, but just try to have some of those conversations too about leave, and there's just a lot of information coming at them and helping them to understand that. But
And it's been a long time since I've been a new educator, obviously, but I know when we do open enrollment, as returning employees, there are some options to have, to set up an appointment or to call to get some assistance. Do we have that? Okay. Perfect.
yeah, that's always a
Okay.
so you can look at how to maybe funnel people that direction.
Yeah.
It's a conversation we have a lot in the sick leave bank when we're looking at. No, that looked great. And we can add vacation.
So we
RASP?
yeah, well, have vacation and all. There you go.
Yeah.
There's your bell. I'll drop it in the folder once we have vacation.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, when I was.
Oh, yeah,
When I was listening in,
It was there, it was split. by the way.
Yeah, and then I think the other ad was, this might be a counter to a counter to a counter, I'm not really sure where we are. in the countering. But our last counter was instead of 3 day, allowing those who, are taking FMLA or child birth adoption leave, allowing them to reserve. Our counter is 4 days of PTO rather than 3 days of PTO.
Because if they take a blackout day.
The idea there that
Yeah.
I think we were-
I think the only other question we had on that one was, as you know, I could take FMLA for a knee surgery and think I'm gonna be out 2 weeks and then complications occur. And I no longer want to keep my 4 days of PTO because I don't wanna go unpaid. If there are complicating factors, because you have to identify ahead of time if you wanna reserve days. If there are complicating factors, would there be an opportunity for somebody to say, actually, I don't want to reserve those days? Because perhaps they would be put in a position where they would be docked for no pay.
I think the hard part on that one is at what point do they let us know that? Because what I would worry about is the person that has that occur and then they come back and a month later, they want to come back and say, oh, I'm actually going to go ahead and use those PTO days. And it becomes a management nightmare on our end. Because we already have a struggle with individuals not putting in their day. Like we're still getting communication about blackout days in August that people are now coming back and saying, oh, I was really sick, August, fill in the blank. And so it's just like this constant.
Especially the first year, honestly, people not knowing about
Yeah,
that form. I'm
Right.
hoping that this year is gonna be
Right.
the worst year for that.
yeah, we are too.
Yeah.
So that would be my only worry on that is the sheer management side of that. And I think if we were gonna look at doing something like that, that would have to be communicated before you return from the FML leave.
But it could be something like, if initially our communication was, I'm gonna take 2 weeks. As part of that communication that says, oh no, it's actually 6. That could be where that could maybe happen, but that makes sense before it
Yes.
returned.
Yeah.
So like I need to extend my FMLA because of that. Can I update my
Right.
selection?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think we would definitely need to know that before anyone returned from.
Okay.
So we didn't want to. So I decided now the year's running out and now I'm gonna go back and say, oh, well, we actually couldn't fit in whatever we planned to go to if that was the case. And so I'm not gonna use the PTO, so now I want the back pay. So I'm trying to think of how we write that. I'll play around with it
Yeah,
and then I'll bring back what
okay, yeah.
my brain
I can see
thinks.
that getting sticky if you don't have something written.
Yep. I'll work on it. Would you mind sending me your version of did you have a Word version or?
Yeah, it's Google Docs, so I can get it into Word.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And then I'll just move from that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Down to our last set of proposals for an elementary specialist.
So we kind of wanted to give you an outline of engagement opportunities we've provided for elementary specialists so far this year. And so overall, we had 60+ elementary specialists from different job categories, providing feedback in a lot of different ways. Whether that was one-on-one conversation, in-person group meetings, we had Zoom engagement, and then we've had many, many different types of surveys since August. And so we just wanted to kind of outline all the work and meetings that have happened between August and now, kind of to where we have proposal to kind of bring forward. So starting back in August with a Zoom and then in-person meetings, which then got us to a survey that we gave out and Zooms. And then Angie and I collaborating with Jill Smith and Liz Harrison throughout kind of feedback loops throughout this as well to kind of ask some clarifying questions to help us move forward. We just wanted to kind of set us up with kind of the background of what has been happening. So we also wanted to share just some quotes from our most recent survey. We are called specialists for a reason. We specialize in a content area. We are skilled and talented in areas that others aren't. Another said, the change to the A to D schedule caused a huge increase in our workload and stretched our budgets. Instead of giving us time to adjust, our schedule was filled and we are drowning in daily work. Gaps in our schedule are needed for setup, rehearsal, planning events, etc. Another said, we teach every single grade level in the entire building, obviously except early childhood. And our planning is not just lesson planning, it's preparing hundreds of materials and major school events. And the last says, traveling doubles the preparation, setup, and transition work for specialists, making it harder to maintain the high quality instruction. So our first proposal is adding language within the elementary scheduling document under the traveling elementary staff. And that's gonna come around. And our proposal is adding number 5. And I'll read it to you and then give more information related to it. It says, assignments and working conditions for traveling specialists will be guided by the conditions for equitable student learning with traveling elementary specialists in Appendix B, which includes but is not limited to access to appropriate instructional spaces, materials and technology, sufficient transition time, inclusion and communication and collaboration loops, and student access equitable learning experience. Student access to equitable learning experiences. On the back of that is a document that has been created and worked on by many, many specialists, those who travel, and we've worked with those specialists who receive the traveling support for us to gather feedback. And so the elementary specialists had created like a top 10 of the most important conditions to kind of create
To allow all the students, regardless if they have the home specialist teacher or a traveling teacher, to have maybe not the exact same experience, but an equitable one so that they can access that curriculum in an equitable fashion.
And this was brought about from just lots of conversations related to, well, what is the standard? What is the expectation? And so working with the elementary specialists, they outlined these things, which we would love in the language we presented for this to be something that guides the work for building administrators and specialists so that we can all have a better understanding of what our students and our educators, if possible, could have. And so we divided into 10 different categories: access to a dedicated instructionally appropriate space. Number 2, availability of necessary instructional materials and supplies. Number 3, sufficient setup and transition time. Number 4, technology, equipment access, and functionality. Number 5, inclusion and building level communication and collaboration. Number 6, equitable planning and duty assignments. Number 7, designated workspace and storage. Number 8, administrative support and advocacy. Number 9, student access to equitable learning experiences. And then 10, recognition as experts in their fields.
I think when we had an opportunity to hear from elementary specialists who are traveling that were in non-ideal circumstances where they were concerned that the students weren't getting an equitable learning experience, the core came down to one of these. And we're not saying that these 10 things don't happen throughout the district. We're saying that if these 10 things are in place as much as realistically possible, okay, that's why we tried to make sure the language provided a little bit of wiggle room for the fact that sometimes we aren't in ideal circumstances. But if we could get these as consistent across the district as possible, we would have a better learning environment for all of our students. You know, things like teaching in music class, in a cafeteria as, floors are being cleaned. You know, that is a very challenging experience, that we've made work, but we want to try to figure out how to make sure all of our students have those equitable learning experiences.
And another aspect would be, this would provide just information and thoughts for, say, a new traveling elementary specialist who's either new to our district to a traveling position, or a building, say, they haven't traveled before and now they're traveling. And that could also go for the administrator, for these to be conversation topics as you're setting up the school year. So maybe it's an administrator who's never received traveling support. And so having this document would provide just conversation points.
Yeah, it would allow those traveling educators and the administrators to say, okay, so here's an issue that I'm facing. I know that this is the best practice that we have. What can we do? So in a lot of cases, we're seeing that, particularly since they're not necessarily, that's not their home school. There's sometimes reluctance to initiate that collaboration. And we know ultimately, as we've talked about over and over again at this table, we can create conditions where our educators and administrators can problem solve the issues, and everybody's aware of them. We have a much higher chance of them getting solved.
So is the proposal for this information in red along with this on the back? This would become language in the contract?
In appendix.
And it would just be for elementary traveling specialists. It wouldn't be for any other itinerant staff.
Because the work that we did was focused on elementary specialists, that is our proposal. We don't have a problem with any of these 10 things happening everywhere, but we kind of had that conversation a little bit about, wouldn't these things be good for everybody? I mean, absolutely. But since we didn't have the opportunity to engage beyond our traveling specialists, that's why we wanted to start there. And keep it with the group that we really focus the feedback on, at least at this point.
Just to keep this in, like, so they did hire 2 or 4 specialists between Clearwater and so really this impacts Fairview, Westview, and traveling specialists for next year. So those are the 3 schools that are impacted. And then, yeah.
And then in future years, that could potentially be different buildings.
And I think the hard thing, like, obviously these schools need traveling specialists for a reason, and space is always like, oh my gosh, so like, yes, absolutely. And even a small building, and I would love to have an extra space, but sometimes, so that is, it's tricky sometimes.
Because it mentions that, like not a hallway, shared office or cafeteria. Well, I don't know how we would guarantee that could never happen. And that's where I worry about the language here and who determines whether it's appropriate or not appropriate. And like the last piece, traveling specialists or experts in their fields and should be utilized primarily at their home and travel buildings for their expertise. So, which I think we would all completely agree with. However, we also have situations where a building has specialists who have, minutes and time well above what's allotted in the contract, and they only need it for other things outside of their specialized area. And so I would worry that would be interpreted that they could no longer be used that way.
Well, none of this is a demand that all 10 of these things must happen. That's why we made the language just stating assignments and working conditions for traveling specialists will be guided by this, but it's not required.
But I think if we put anything in the
It's
contract,
in the agreement, it's
yeah,
a binding document.
yeah.
It's-
Sure. Traveling specialist. I would. I would love to like this is guidance for me as I receive it. Does that make sense? Like I would like just great reminders. Like yes, absolutely, I need to be doing all these things. I just like in the like I would love to receive this as a, but not necessarily in an like. Does that make sense? I would word that. Yeah.
And this, I think, is more just, I think we're running into, because I agree, right? There is, this is a necessary document because these things are not like standard practice across our, do you know what I mean? And like, we understand the flexibility of the 36 elementary schools, like, no matter what we bring to the table, that is gonna be hard to find something that is standard fit for everybody. So I totally agree with some of the thoughts around putting it in the negotiated agreement. But it's also, we found a pretty big need to establish these kind of standardized things.
Certainly open to other wordsmithing that helps identify that these are ideal conditions, but not guaranteed. I don't know. Some of that the right way.
And I think some of that language exists already. For instance, recognition as experts in their fields. Traveling specialists are experts in their fields and should be utilized primarily at their home and travel building for their expertise. So you've got that,
So who decides that it's primarily what they're, if you have a
Sure.
situation where a specialist doesn't have as many sections in the building, there could be an argument made that, I'm being used, X hours of the day for something that's not in my expertise. So I think it's just something we're gonna have to really come through and probably have a lot more conversation with a much larger group outside of just us.
Do you have one more, related to specialists? We wanted to put the traveling specialist stuff together. And now we want to introduce one more. And then this is it. So the feedback, like we said, on the conditions was created really throughout the year from the traveling specialists. The thing that you see coming around now is also in Appendix D. We put them on two pieces of paper because I'm not gonna say they're two completely separate issues. We wanted to keep the traveling stuff together and then the stuff regarding specialists with time outside of planned PLC duty-free lunch. So that's why they're on two separate pieces of paper. The first thing you'll notice is it looks like we have taken everything and just completely X'd it out. And I want you to know that the reason we did that is that we found as we were making changes based on the elementary specialist feedback, it was messier to try to keep these three words in a row and then move this piece over here than it was to present it in the way that we have it here. So what we have done is we've kept kind of the core of that initial sentence is that this particular policy is about those that has time outside of that 300 minutes of plan, 30-minute PLC. So those numbers are all the same. Our intent was not to add anything there. We went ahead and just tried to focus on the 3 key things: student learning, staff collaboration, and building programs. So that's the main difference you'll see between the first sentence in the original policy and this first sentence in the proposed policy. And then we wanted to take the core of what we heard from our elementary specialists, and the 3 things that we heard over and over and over again were: 1, we want our professional expertise to really be the center of our job. 2, we want to have clearer, the word procedure is a little too detailed for what I'm looking for, but clear guardrails on collaborative planning. And then we also wanted to take a look at the fact that sometimes throughout the year, the way that the specialists are used with that time beyond those items I've said like 4 times, how those things can and should change. We want to make sure that they also have a voice when those changes take place. So the use of this time will be determined collaboratively between the specialist and the principal with the following expectations. So we tried to highlight the first one there is being able to have priority given to responsibilities that are aligned to the educator's area of expertise. But just because something's a priority doesn't mean it happens 100% of the time, but really centering, hey, you were hired as a music teacher, so we want you to spend as much time as possible with things related to teaching music, because that is the gift, that is the expertise you bring into Olathe Public Schools. Collaborative planning will occur at the beginning of each semester to establish how the time will be used. And of course, that could happen more often if necessary, ensuring clarity, predictability, and respect for the specialist's primary role. If there are significant changes in student building or programmatic needs, because those happen, the specialist and administrator will collaborate to determine shifts in the use of the time. And then if the building needs require support outside of the specialist certification area, assignments will be determined through collaboration with the specialist to maintain a balance between meeting student needs and honoring the specialist's primary role and expertise. So we still have that opportunity for specialists to meet the needs that are at the building, but still being able to have a little bit of that back and forth between, okay, so here are the 2 things that aren't maybe related to my certification area that are the biggest needs for the building. This one, for this set of circumstances I am most uncomfortable with, could I go this direction with it? So being able to have that collaboration being a little bit more explicitly outlined. And then rather than having a laundry list of different things, we wanted to try to keep it more broad so that the building needs could be centered as well. So possible uses of this time would include designing and delivering enrichment opportunities that relate to the content area and provide cost-curricular connections. One specialist talked about how if you have a student who needs to work on motor skills, being able to look at, okay, let's work on holding a pair of scissors as a way that is connected to their content area, but also have some of those cross-curricular connections. Obviously, that's a lower level, a more primary level concern. Providing academic support related to their content area, collaborating with educators to enhance curriculum with specialized expertise. So maybe in a math lesson, students really struggling with the concept, there's a certain formula they can't remember. Oh, music teacher, can we work together on a song that would help them remember this formula? So finding, I think there's some creative ways we can use our specialists' expertise to really buttress those skills that our students maybe are needing a little bit of extra help with. And the last one, of course, is kind of that ability to be able to pull in those building-wide initiatives that we have talked about.
I think I use specialists just personally with like intervention. I will be the first to admit, like, yes, that wasn't their primary duty. But it was a way that, you know, we always think about that divide of specialists and gen ed teachers, but it was a way that really brought our building together. And I haven't been able to use it now with our new schedule and stuff, because we had like a building wide walk too. And I will just say, like, I know it wasn't their first choice or whatever. But I really think, like, as a building leader, like, it really brought us all on the same page. And I don't want that divide to happen, you know, with certain language, like, does that make sense? Like, oh, I don't do reading, so. But I know the PE teacher's really good at reading, but I just think it's like all hands on deck, or we just don't do it. And I'm just like, I'm protecting specialists, I'm protecting gen ed teachers in that sense of like, that's really important as a building culture. And I mean, they were some of the best interventionists because they didn't let all the noise about reading, you know, like they just followed the script and they did it. And I don't know. And that's just, and I'm just speaking on one building, whatever, you know, but, and just seeing it both ways now, like, and I'm just sharing that. I'm not, it has nothing to do with the language. I'm just sharing that as a.
Well, I think it's important that these frank conversations happen, because I see, like, you know, I think there's a very fine line, and I'm just gonna speak as a music teacher at Countryside. But hearing and being on the receiving end of so many, you know, people that bring forward real concerns and real complaints. I think it's a very fine balance of I don't think you're gonna find a specialist that's like, they don't even know how to read. Like, you know what I mean? Like, nobody's gonna say that. And I also don't think you're gonna find anybody that, when we see such large chunks of discrepancy, I don't control the number of sections I have, right? But if I have X number of minutes beyond, I don't think the people that I've worked with in our fields, elementary specialists, not gonna be like, well, sorry you're drowning, but like, I'm gonna be over here. I think this is being brought forward in a spirit of everybody is working for the service of the kids. I think it's that very fine line of if there is an administration, if there's a principal problem, right? So my principal is gone. An elementary school principal is not going to be asked to sub in at a high school, because the job has enough of the crossing where it's a lot of the same, but it is a different animal, right? And like, that is obviously just an example, but like we're falling into that a little bit. Love Wit and Wisdom. I didn't have any say, right? Like when we piloted it and things like that, I've not been trained. I don't know why it's better. I know that I want my kids to be able to read, but I'm not educated on the whys behind it. So I think I completely see where we're coming from. And it's finding that middle ground is like, I can service my kids. I can service my kids the best when I am using what I'm the best at, what I am trained in, what I have my multiple degrees in, and things like that, to help them meet those standards that they need in their curriculum, reading, math, science, things like that. You know what I mean? So it is not an easy answer, and the classroom teacher versus specialist versus the specialist and the specialist, and this grade versus this grade. It's never going to be a solved thing because education changes. Sorry, now I'm on a box. Sorry about that. But like, education is constantly changing and things like that, right? I think it is the recognition of I did not have any sort of input. No specialist is included in the input of choosing a reading curriculum, obviously, but the curriculum was chosen knowing that we would have to rely on this kind of supplemental staff. Does that make sense? Like the way that I'm saying, like, does that make sense? Like you,
And I think that's
Sure.
because, quite honestly, because there are certified staff who have availability in their schedule.
What-
And it'd be
100%.
inappropriate and, we would, I'm gonna just talk frankly.
no, yeah,
We would be looking at having specialists on part-time contracts then, and we're going to be handcuffed and being told that they can't be used for anything but teaching music.
Yeah,
And so
100%.
that's the part that I'm struggling with when I'm trying to wrap my head around this is, the first grade teacher.
does not get a say in.
And they don't get, extra minutes in their day.
Sure.
So I'm trying to think kind of like, as Tricia was
Yep.
saying, how
Yeah.
do we?
What?
Because all of this reads as though that the administrator, who quite honestly is going to be held responsible for
Mm,
all of it,
mm,
is going to have very little control over how they can use staff in their building
mm.
that have time available to support some of these areas, whether it's covering ISS and I know those are things that,
Mhm.
are not in the specialized, world
Sure.
and training you all have,
So I
but
think,
that's.
sorry, I don't mean to.
You're good.
So I think what we're talking about is, and I appreciate the frames because this is like a technical reality we're living in, and also there is a very strong emotional component in this. That, obviously won't even resolve itself in negotiated agreements. 100%. I don't think anybody on our side of the table or any elementary specialist. Sorry, but I'm gonna do this. I think it's a recognition of, that sort of balance and things like that. So 100%, I think we welcome as a team any feedback on language and things like that, because I anticipate this being a lot of collaboration went into this and will need to continue being used going forward.
I think another thing I would just like to bring it to the table is there are buildings where the specialist doing interventions is causing a bigger divide. And there are specialists who feel so terrible because they're tracking the data from their interventions, and some of their kids are actually getting worse. And the specialist inside feels like we've had many people come to us and say, it doesn't feel good that what I'm doing is like making it worse. And so I do think it should be spoken that there are buildings where it builds the collaboration, but we do have currently buildings where it is creating another divide. And then the other thing I just want to bring up is throughout this language, I think a big piece of this is recognizing the aspects of specialist jobs that are events or programming that are expected of our positions, but there's no like dedicated planning time. And so it's finding that recognition of like a music teacher is required at least 2 performances a year, a K-2 and a 3-5. That's a requirement of our job. Obviously some do more, but that's what we need. And so thinking of that, like PE teachers, I'm assuming it would be a requirement that there's some sort of a field day event. Art teachers, some sort of art fair. I don't know. I don't live their job category, so I haven't necessarily dug into their job description. But just thinking of this language, I think is really coming from our specialists wanting to be recognized, that we're providing outside of our K-6 lessons, we're providing programming, and those specialists wanting just recognition. Like, could there be a possibility where, I don't know, this isn't related specific to the language, but like in my musical season, if I had to do interventions, could during my 2 musical seasons, I have less intervention time so that I could be on that, doing that? Or book fair, could I, the week before book fair and the week of book fair, could I not have my interventions? Just trying to think of ways where We're also uplifting those programs that require lots of outside work, time, communication with companies and professionals that are only working during the same hours that we work. And so I think that's like the spirit of this language, is us trying to find a better way to uplift our specialists and help them feel recognized for the work that we know when we sign up to be this position, the work that comes with that, but also.
And I just want to emphasize that there is no place in this language that says the special is determined. Just like our first grade teachers don't get to set their schedule. There is no place in here it says the specialist alone does that. Every single time it says in collaboration with the principal, because we know that the reality is that if the allocations were followed exactly, that some of our specialists would be 0.7, and we want to try to keep that full-time specialist. And I also want to really acknowledge that last bullet supporting building-wide initiatives. Our specialists are not protesting to supporting the building. They just want a little bit more of a say in how could they be used to do that. So our conversation about interventions are a building-wide initiative. So I do not think this language shuts the door on that. It just highlights a little bit more like, hey, what's the best fit? And that could vary building by building. But we just kind of wanted to highlight that the perception that this allows the specialist to say, here's what I'm going to do. That is not what this language says.
I'll probably start with a little bit of background because not everybody around this table was involved. First thing to point out is we're actually in a new salary schedule that we developed back in 2023. And we've implemented it for the 23-24 school year. And the thought process behind the schedule is to create some variables to react to some of the volatility that happens in the funding in Kansas. So we had several variables. You have step movement, you have indices that take money from the base and flow down, and any combination of those at the same time. And we're really looking for some of those, that flexibility. And last year it worked out really well in that when we received additional state and local funding, we were able to essentially move that the equivalent of 3. I understand we eliminated the top and the bottom, but that gave some great movement. And we're going to have to lean on that flexibility again this year as we make our proposal. As we understand it, just recapping for the notice letter, you had an interest in increasing the beginning salaries, an allowance for a minimum of at least one step, column movement, leave the salary schedule intact, don't eliminate steps and add steps. And then looking for additional compensation for related to the CEUs we discussed, and the coverage. Also examining the supplemental pays as we do each year, and then establish a District 403B match. Just reiterating, as we did last year, we have to really focus on short, long-term sustainability, and also recruitment and retainment of another 50% of the workforce in our classified bargaining unit staff. Kind of our starting position this year, we moved up the chart. We're not at the very bottom anymore. You can see the comparison to the other districts. Obviously, they're all in negotiations right now as well, moving that starting teacher salary. So, sorry. Sorry, my finger is too fat. So, our proposal this evening is to establish a $50,000 starting salary. That's $1,500 higher than the 48.5. We would place all new hires on step 2. We don't have a step 1 any longer, so it's that top step. We would place any new hires with experience based upon that, the level and column, based on years of experience to our current staff, which is something we still need to work out, refining that schedule and making sure that we're both in agreement on what that looks like. We'd also provide the column movement again this year, increase the extracurricular stipends to be tied to that 50,000 as we had established it. And then also for the 7th year in a row, absorb the health insurance premiums. And right now, those are projected to be across the board $5.5 million increase is what's going to be necessary in order to fund the plan. So when you look at it from a high level, just on the funding level, that base going from 48.5 to 50, and Eric, you can check me. I believe it's about $5.9 million, or about a 3.1% increase, and that increase is every cell is 3.1, because if you honor the indices, it's not, well, somebody got 1 and somebody got 5, it's 3.1 all the way across. I'm using $1 million for column movement. I know it hovered around 650 this year, just trying to make sure it's not an anomaly because it came down so significantly compared to prior years. It costs about $150,000 in order to, when you increase the base 50,000, the extracurriculars will naturally go up that 150. Additions, we just are looking at this evening. And then half of that health insurance, about 50% of the work, if you use the 50% of the workforce is participating, that's about $2.7 million. So that's about $9.8 million or 5.1%. And as I've looked up, inflation's about 2.8. So we're staying ahead of inflation, which is something we've been trying to do. Kind of looking bullet by bullet, comparing to the proposal, obviously addressing the increase in beginning salaries by moving to the 50,000, addressing the column movement. But what you don't see this evening is any step movement. That's where I talk about the flexibility of that schedule. At least in my mind, there were years we knew we could do multiple, and there were going to be years where we have to decide, do we put it on the base, let it flow through the indices, because we don't have enough to do both of those pieces. So the proposal this evening is to put it all up in that base and let it flow through the schedule. The examination of the revised supplementals, obviously it increases, we're saying the same thing, that $50,000 would let that money flow through the extracurriculars. But some of the remaining items, the CEUs, we're not opposed to it. It's very much like last year we talked about the 403B. We did not propose doing that because we're trying to maximize everything. And I'm not putting down a challenge, but we have less than $1 million of new money. So to come up with 9, let's do something somewhere else. We're gonna be leaning on reserves. We're gonna be leaning on every savings we can find. So at this point, we did not add that into the proposal. Similarly, we did not, for the coverage, we did not increase it at this point. And the 403B match, we did not include in the proposal. As I mentioned, we also are utilizing, keeping the premiums the same for the coming year. And one of the reasons for that is we may have to lean back on that reserve a bit. So paying for the health insurance, if it was all in the compensation side, and let's say we just pass on increases and we don't have a 0 individual plan anymore, that's all general fund then. Whereas if something goes south in the middle of the year, we could lean on the health reserve if we needed to, just as we're gonna probably lean on our contingency and our special ed reserves. The good news is it gets not outstandingly better, but next year it's projected to be about $4.5 million increase and then 7 because we get BOTA all out and we can measure it because we're pointing back. If we increase our enrollment through Lathe Advantage, that'd be great because we can look to the current year for our accounts again. That was passed in the legislature. But unfortunately, right now we're pointing back because we're in that decline mode. So that would be the proposal for this evening. And I don't know why it won't advance. It's frozen up. There we go. Just questions. But probably I'll go back to that summary, any summary page.
A quick question.
Yes.
Where 4 million next year? Where's that coming from?
Right now, any new money we're getting in base aid is getting taken away because we lose $4.5 million in BOTA money.
Okay.
Board of Tax Appeals, that revenue source. It's kind of out of our system. We only lose the last $1 million comes out next year. So with CPI having been up the last couple of years, base will go up again and we'll get to keep the 4.5. Base is going to go up again. The following year we'll have $7 million. So we're being a little aggressive in the compensation plan, knowing something's coming, and that if we can't locate it, can't get it through, and you're not going to get $9 million worth of retirements if we can't. But every $500,000 sure helps get there. But if at the end of the year we need to take $1 million from reserves, we'll be doing that. I did explore, even though it wasn't an interest, let's get rid of stuff at the top and bottom. I think the increases are better this way. Eric, I'll welcome your looking at it. Towards the top, it wasn't as good as if you could just let those indices work. So that's why I opted this way, but we're kind of open. The pie is the pie, as I always, sort of my shtick that I always say, but at this point, this was our proposal that we wanted to put on the table.
Can you explain a little bit as you're estimating cost, why we look at half the total cost of health insurance?
You're about half the workforce. It's very hard. I can't say.
Okay.
Unit cost this, so I just use half.
That's a global inclusion, all of us. Okay.
So then we use the percentages.
Are you able to share, John, when you said to meet this compensation plan, we obviously are still locking in money.
Yes.
And we'll be making kind of cuts to other things. Are you able to share some of the areas you are thinking about making kind of, I'm assuming
It would be more like administrative department stuff.
just out of
Principals
curiosity.
aren't going to get any additional things are going to cost them. Just tightening those non-class compensation type things up.
Just
It
a little
won't
bit.
get us all the way there.
Yeah.
We're hoping our ratings may be up. Right now, we budget as if at-risk population isn't going to increase or CTE doesn't. It will get a little bit there. And I don't want to say, I don't want to sound like we're being irresponsible, but it is kind of a jumping off the cliff with the money. That's why we had to make sure we benefit the schedule as much as we can. We have a plan B if we can't make a good chunk of money to where we get to next year. We may be having very serious conversations next year as we look at a new funding formula. What, it has to be in place. It won't go into effect for another year, but we'll know next legislative session and what they're up to. Or is it gonna be, leave it alone? Are we just gonna try to do something with SPED, or are they gonna come after, well, we don't like paying this CPI, let's just start cutting that out. Then we have a real problem on our hands. I don't want to oversell, it's getting so much greener going forward, but we are kind of clinging to, can we get this voted done and get one more year under our belt? And then at least that's not a variable anymore. But it's kind of going to the well once. If we don't get some relief next year, those reserves will probably be down. We're gonna have to look even harder at how are we gonna make that work.
People in the share, just so we can make
I'm
sure
gonna,
all of
I have a PDF, I'm gonna put it in the shared folder.
Beautiful.
So much fun. The administrative team, I know Dr. Yeager's email to staff, like regular updates on legislative action, I think has been hugely informative for our bargaining unit. So just a shout out and a kudos. I think that does a lot to help explain the pie is the pie, and people at this table do not have much say in what ingredients go into it. So just a shout out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Preaching to the choir a little bit, you know the importance. If we get 5,000 staff members to understand how critical the next legislative session is to their income. Moving in a vacuum at very high speed.
Yeah.
Not being anti-legislature. Just that's the reality.
Yeah.
If you want your voice to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's pretty, what's the word, like, to write a new funding formula in that amount of time is quite the undertaking.
And not egotistically, there is not a single business official on that committee. And we're the ones that understand it inside and out.
There isn't.
No.
Yours is the full of bite in the butt.
You're out of nowhere, it seems, about next February.
Sorry, I think I'm being duo real quick.
Oh. This over. I'm not. So thank you all again, and we will be back at the Ed Center. Bye.
Next Monday.
Oh, are we? Yeah, so 1 week
get a whole
today.
Yeah.
A whole week. Versus a 1 day less.
We created a compensation.
I'm not
Without that, with all the.
I'm not. I knew